First, please welcome to the stage Naman Ahuja. Naman Ahuja is Professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and the editor of Marg. He is a specialist in the field of ancient Indian art, and his writings have explored the history of aesthetics through shifts in iconography and transculturalism in antiquity, the legacy of the arts and crafts movement in the modern period, and the changing narratives for Indian art in museums. Next, please join me in welcoming Suresh Kumar Mutakumaran. Suresh Kumar has a master's in Greek and Roman history from the University of Oxford and a PhD in history from University College London. He is currently a lecturer in history at the National University of Singapore. His research focuses on interactions between people in ancient Afro-Eurasia with an eye to examining long-distance connectivity. And conducting the conversation is our good friend William Dalrymple, the author of the Wolfson Prize-winning White Moguls, Duff Cooper Prize-winning Last Mogul, and the Hemingway Kapuscinski Prize-winning Return of a King. His book, The Anarchy, was shortlisted for the Duke of Wellington Medal, the Tata Book of the Year, and the Historical Writers Association Award, and won the 2020 Arthur Ross Medal from the US Council on Foreign Relations. He has held visiting lectureships at Princeton, Brown, and Oxford, where he is currently a visiting fellow at All Souls. More important than any of that, of course, he is a founder and co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Over to you, Willie.
Thank you, Paul. A couple of years ago, after lockdown, I went to Angkor Wat. And for anyone who's spent their life in this area, it's extraordinary to see stories that originated in the vicinity of Jaipur and Delhi. Sculpted so very, very far away. You go down one corridor, there's Kurukshetra, just to the north of Delhi, all the stories that are happening there. Down another corridor, you see the tales of Krishna and all the stories that are taking place around Mathura and so on. The influence of India across much of Asia is there hiding in plain sight, in the Buddhism of Korea and Japan, in the place names of Java and Cambodia, in the sculpture, in the religious ceremonies that still carry on in Bali. And yet it's something which we failed to connect up. And the panel today, I am very, very proud to bring two good friends and two wonderful experts on this subject to join the dots. Naman Ahuja, who is the great historian of art in Delhi. We've sadly lost two of our greatest art historians and friends of the festival this year, both Kavita Singh, his colleague, earlier in the year, and B.N. Goswami more recently. So Naman is the last one standing. We need to look after you and keep you swaddled in cotton wool, Naman. Look after your health, please. He has spent half a lifetime studying Gandhara, the influence of classical and other influences on that region, but he's also done a lot of work more recently on what's been going on in the south. Buddhism is often thought of as a North Indian phenomenon, and we forget that when Xuanzang first came to, the Chinese traveler monk came to India. While he certainly wanted to see Nalanda first, he also very much wanted to see Kanchipuram and the major Buddhist sites in South India. And that has been the focus, particularly the site of Panigiri, of some of Naman's new work. Suresh has done a spectacular book that I hope all of you have heard his session on the tropical turn and his session with Arti. He is a wonderful scholar of migration and the diffusion of both species and ideas. But today he's going to be speaking specifically on the whole issue of what is often called, in inverted commas, the Indianization of Southeast Asia, and how far this is a word that's accurate and acceptable, or how far it's actually misleading. So we're going to start off in India with Naman. I'm going to hand over to you. Both men are going to speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll join it all together and then throw it open to questions.
Okay, sure. I've, for the past 15 odd years, been teaching courses on transculturalism and globalization in antiquity. And my specialization happens to be in the field of iconography. A lot of the books that I've contributed to or written have looked at the aesthetics that lie behind iconographic or visual communication. The migration of a visual culture from one part of a world to another is something that interests me, and I try and share with my students in my classes. So let's look at the PowerPoint. And what might the forces of those migrations have been? Was it through traders, teachers, or travelers, as this session's called? Now, William raised something quite exciting. He said that wherever he went in mainland Southeast Asia, he found corridors named after the places in North India. Ayutthayas and Kurukshetras, and ought we not then to think of them much like we do the moving of Adelaides and Perths and New Yorks? Is William trying to make us see that before one anarchy there was another William, that there was another colonialism fostered by India?
I've already raised on an earlier session on the Cholas, where the possibility of the Tamil merchant guilds being precursors of the East India Company in this room, and I have to say it didn't go down well.
Oh, right. Well, the question has to be raised. That's the point. That what happens when sacred geographies and place names are being copied and emulated? Is it a cultural transfer? Is it a knowledge transfer? Is it a use of the raw materials of that place which are being commandeered by South Asia for being sold and further traded? Or what was the definition of colonialism? Perhaps one needs to think about the use of one land for raw material and for market. What was going on then in Southeast Asia? How do we think about these traders? How do we think about these knowledge transfers? What were these teachers doing? Was this an acculturation of Southeast Asia, rendering them without their lingua francas and forever turning them into Sanskrit speakers, and ennobled by Tamil, or ennobled by Sanskrit, or ennobled by whatever language they were now getting? And was travel, therefore, merely a transculturalism that we look at innocently, or do we actually read a political and economic history into that transculturalism that took place in antiquity? Now, I don't think the two things are always the same. I think there is a difference between what happened in the early modern period and what happened in antiquity, and I think there is but that's also because we don't have very rich resources. And my field is to be able to try and lend a little bit to these kinds of questions through the visual culture, which is the art history. And in the end, I want to say that with all of this knowledge, what of all this migration and transculturalism in a world where we are becoming increasingly national chauvinistic, where chest thumping and national pride seem to be far more important rather than sharing across borders, where the anxiety of losing your culture is more? Of what use my classes in university for the past 20 years when, frankly speaking, the national culture, not just in India, but everywhere, seems to be one of closing doors to the forces of globalization? So how can modern museums and exhibition making actually make a difference to all of this? So I think these are some of the questions which have guided our questioning and our writing. Now, what shall I point this toward? Can we get to the first slide? It's not, oh, okay. So I specialize in what is called the post-Mauryan period, which is the period of the Satavahanas in south and central India, and the Kushans in northern India. And the Kushans are sort of actively trading with a part of the world which is, we loosely call the Roman world, but that's really a bit of a misnomer, because the Roman world is a very much splendid, multicolored empire with many, many provinces, and they're not all, some of them are in contact with India, even if Rome is directly not in contact with India. There is a lot that is going on with the Hellenistic world, with Egypt, and the connection with India. The Satvahana Empire is also connected with Egypt, but it's also connected with mainland Southeast Asia, with island Southeast Asia. And so those are the two ends of the trade that I look at. Or perhaps can't look at. We've got a new clicker, but it doesn't seem to be...
Or a battery into the clicker that's not working. Oh, could you put the next slide forward?
Okay. So the book that I did on Panigiri, which Mark published a couple of years ago now, it looks at a remarkable stupa in Telangana, about a 2-hour drive away from Hyderabad, which has been found covered with limestone sculptures of an exquisite quality and significance, which beggar belief, some of them. They come from what is, in art historical parlance, called the late Satvahana, early Ikshvaku style, which means that they belong to about the 2nd to 4th centuries AD, the period that we call the Kushan period in northern India. And this lot of sculpture has some life-size sculptures which we hadn't seen ever before. Got a big Toran gateway, like the one you have at Sanchi. You have beautiful statues of the Buddha. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please.
Okay. Yeah, it's called Panigiri because it's like the pan of a serpent. And the whole rock is S-shaped, like a serpent, like a nag. And in the middle of the rock, you'll see a little square where, rather like the mani, which is the jewel which is kept in the serpent's hood, there is a little jewel of a monastery that lies inside the serpent. And that is the ancient monastery and stupa on top of Panigiri Hill. Now, amongst the sculptures that were found there, many of them were found smashed in pieces. But there are these Buddha statues, which look a lot like the Buddha statues that we get in Anuradhapura, Amaravati, and all along the coast. So it means that Indian ideas were migrating from here and going down southward. We still don't see a flaming Ushnisha, the little flame on top that you start getting from about the 3rd, 4th century. So this might be a little earlier. And it's a very good example to see how the Buddha statue actually moves to Anuradhapura at this time. The most spectacular of the sculptures found at the site of Panigiri is one which used to be outside the monastery. And it shows the lesson of how not to hold on to power. It's a story of Siddhartha throwing away his inheritance and patrimony. He throws away his turban, and the turban goes flying up into the sky where it is received by celestials. It's a rather remarkable sculpture and a very interesting choice of sculpture to position outside a monastery. Meaning, this is the lesson that the young monks are being shown on their way in and out of the monastery. Their placement is quite interesting. Next slide, please. Yeah. Panigiri has many other things which have deepened our understanding of what goes on in the culture of Andhra and how it moves towards Southeast Asia and moves to Sri Lanka in particular. So what were the kind of objects that moved from places like this to Southeast Asia at this time? And amongst them, some years ago, was this extraordinary discovery of a bronze ewer that turned up in the Mekong Delta, somewhere between Cambodia and Vietnam, that ended up now at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And researching its composition and looking at it, its handle seems to be of a type that is made in Gandhara. The shape is of the type which is widely recorded in Amaravati. So it's a Kushan Satavahana design of a bronze vessel with the elephant spout and all, probably about the 2nd century. but found again all the way far east in the Mekong. Okay, let's try and move. Now, previously, I'd done a lot of work in the region of Gandhara. And as my research deepened, I began to notice that there was inadequate attention being paid to the connections of the intermediaries, those who mediated the trade with South Asia, i.e. the Egyptians. People were always keen to talk about Gandhara as provincial Roman art or as Hellenistic, as a vestige of Hellenistic art. But they were always trying to connect it with what was going on in Greece at that time, rather than trying to connect it with what was going on in Egypt at that time. And I had to really think about why Egypt. What are the connections with Egypt? And I began to look at these Egyptian objects that had been found in Gandhara. Serapis, for instance, is a very distinctly Egyptian Roman god. Porphyry, we know, was only mined, a type of stone which was only found in northern Egypt. The cameo of Heracles, found in Bannu in the northwest frontier, is actually of a type which is quite Egyptian in the way that it has been sculpted. We found other Egyptian deities, like Harpocrates, the child of Isis. Now, little statuettes of Harpocrates have been found in Takshila, in Begram in Afghanistan, and in Mathura in northern India. So what were these little Egyptian statuettes doing traveling to India? What kind of people were bringing these Egyptian statuettes to India? So rather than looking at it all as just Roman trade with India, one needed to prise open the nature of that Roman trade and look at its specific complexion as one that was coming from Egypt at that time. And this is borne out by the kind of textual sources on the periplus of the Erythraean Sea and the kind of trade that was going on in Berenike. And hey presto, now we have a temple to Buddha, a shrine to Buddha and the Vrishnis that has been found in the courtyard of a temple to Isis in Berenike.
Is it now thought to be a shrine or just a statue?
I think it's a small shrine alongside
Brilliant.
Now, looking at this melange of ideas, I tried to summarize it all in a paper that I wrote called One Mother, Many Mother Tongues, looking at one statue, where I found that rather remarkably, that one statue seems to be surrounded by children of different iconographic systems of the ancient world. Something Zoroastrian, something Phoenician or Lebanese, or Cypriot, whatever you want to call it, but of the Roman period. The Dioscuri, who are Hellenistic, Harpocrates, who is Egyptian, Kartikeya, who is the son of Shiva, all surrounding one figure who sits rather like a Madonna and child, prior to which one might have called her Demeter, prior to which, or alongside, one might have called her Isis, or in Sanskrit sources, one would call her Amatrika, and Buddhist sources, you would call her Ahareti. So what is the effect of all of this transculturalism? Are we losing cultural specificity? This kind of a sculpture was put on the outside wall of a monastery in Peshawar area in about 200 AD. What does that tell us about the kind of population that was living in the Peshawar area in 200 AD? That all of the people who came from Lebanon and Egypt and Greece and Iran and India could identify the little children around the mother goddess and all know that they belonged to the cult of the mother goddess, and the monks in the monastery were going to be able to look after them. Now, visual statues like this are performing a certain public function. We have to think about the public placement of these things. And I think these kinds of images tell us a lot about what's going on in the public environment at that time. Now, moving to what I've been more interested in recently has been things in South India. And in Maharashtra, there were these discoveries of some late Hellenistic, early Roman objects, Perseus and Andromeda, or a statuette of Poseidon, that came up in a place called Brahmagiri, which is not too far from Kolhapur. These are things that are lying in the Kolhapur Museum. And they'd all been kept together in one hoard. Somebody had protected it and kept it all together. Now, it's not just that these things are coming to India, but Indian things are going to the rest of the world. And in Hoxne, in England, you have this wonderful pepper mill, which was found with pepper in it. And the pepper we know went from India, from Kerala or somewhere to the British Isles. And it's at the same time when this extraordinary ivory statuette was found in the debris from about the same period or maybe a little earlier, definitely before 79 AD when Mount Vesuvius erupted, because that ivory statuette was found in Pompeii. And I've been sort of reopening the conversation around that figure that was found in Pompeii. It's clearly probably made in central India or Maharashtra, but excavated all the way out in Italy. And that does make us think about what did the Italians imagine this was? Why were they importing it? Was she just a curious bit of exotica? Or did they realize that this was a yakshi, a nature spirit? Did it have meaning for the Italian who wanted to bring in interesting figures into his garden, which were connected with the worship of nature and the pantheon that was connected with plants? It seems that he was somebody who might have wanted these kinds of iconographic elements. And so the Italian importer is not somebody who's doing this mindlessly, perhaps, merely because he's looking for exotica, but perhaps because he's a little bit more informed. And that makes it all the more interesting for us because it means that ideas are migrating between people with a certain kind of awareness. I'm going to end with this slide because this was the last big project that I was involved with as a co-curator of an exhibition called India in the World, in which the British Museum lent 100 sculptures, which we paired in conversation with about 100 odd sculptures from Indian collections. So rather than seeing the history of the world in 100 objects through the lens of the British Museum, we tried to take those 100 objects from the lens of the British Museum and pose questions to them through the lens of another 100 objects chosen from an Indian perspective. And we put them in conversation and in dialogue with each other in order to be able to see what happens to world history if we look at transculturalism from an Indian perspective. Can there be an Indian way of thinking about world history rather than looking at our colonizers' way of thinking about world history? And let's actually try and address this question straight. And let's see, how does it make a difference? What are the practical differences that we have to make in the way we communicate these kinds of histories of transculturalism to the public? Or do we just want to create a little bit of propaganda, which seems to be failing, about some kind of bonhomie that existed in the world? Oh, look, we were all connected and we've all come from one place and we're all migrants. Well, nobody really in the political classes seems to care. And so we've got to be able to do something to be able to take those anxieties or those put-downs and those problems front and center, and let's try and talk about them at the museum, because I think the museum and educational institutions do still have a role to play, and I don't think we are completely irrelevant.
Okay. Are the slides working?
Could we go into the second PowerPoint?
Yeah. Great, thanks. So I want to get us started with where William brought us right at the beginning at Angkor Wat. If you go to Angkor, in the first gallery of the temple, you would observe a colossal 8-armed Ashtabhuja image of Vishnu, which is believed to have been the central image of the temple, but it's no longer in the Garbhagriha, which now houses 4 Buddha images. Now, this image of Ashtabhuja Vishnu is not treated as Vishnu, even though Cambodians are aware of Vishnu as a sort of subsidiary deity who has been appropriated in a Buddhist context, but rather the statue is venerated as an ancestor spirit. So if you go to Angkor Wat on festive occasions, locals will sort of bring offerings, including non-vegetarian offerings, to this image of Vishnu. So on one particular day that I was at Angkor Wat, there was a huge roasted pork that was offered to Vishnu. Now that's unthinkable, of course, in an Indian context, but for many Cambodians, these statues are not seen as Hindu statues, but rather ancestor spirits. Now this notion may be a very old one. A lot of the earliest Hindu temples in Cambodia, those that date between the 6th and 8th centuries, were built on top of proto-historic cemeteries. Now this is not unlike the Buddhist stupas that we see in South India, which very often occupied megalithic sites. They're grafting themselves onto something that is already existing. Now this point is very important. India and Southeast Asia share a common cultural and environmental substratum. There is already a lot in common before this conversation, before this exchange or cultural diffusion takes place. I mean, think about things like tree spirits. The belief in tree spirits is pervasive in Thailand, and we know this is ancient because they're venerating trees that are native to Southeast Asia, trees that are not venerated in India or found in India. The Hopea odorata tree, for example, which is locally called Nang Takien in Thailand, and very often locals would bring offerings of beautiful dresses which they would hang on the trees as sort of an offering to this tree spirit. It's kind of a Yakshi cult, but there are also features that you would only find in Thailand. And there are multiple examples of this all across Southeast Asia. Also the veneration of the sacred landscape, of rocks. Some of the earliest Shaivite temples in Cambodia, for example, we don't find a Shivalinga, but a natural rock formation that is being worshipped as a Swayambhu Linga, and possibly, just like the cemetery sites, these rock sites might have already been sacred to the populations. So Hinduism and Buddhism, sort of grafting themselves onto pre-existing cultural practices, and they're also appropriating them, right? That might explain the ease of the Indianization, as it were, of Southeast Asia. Now, for better or worse, this term has gained currency and has come to stay. But it is a problematic term. It has been rejected altogether in some circles. It is true that the meta-language, the framework of classical Southeast Asia is very Indian, but the undercurrents, the way in which this is interpreted, is very Southeast Asian. I mean, this would be clear to anyone from India visiting Southeast Asia. There's something familiar about the culture, but it's also radically different in the way it's interpreted and the way it plays out in public life.
What was the famous Tagore quote? Tagore, when he visited Angkor Wat, said, "I felt I'd seen something very familiar," which was also very strange.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the same with Bali, right? It's a Hindu island, but the version of Hinduism that's practiced there is radically different from what we might be familiar with in India. Now, the agents of cultural diffusion are really sort of multifarious characters. We have, the title alluded to teachers, travelers, traders, and so on. In the earliest periods, it's quite clear that we have lots of mercantile families who were responsible for the diffusion of cultural features. And for a long time, this used to be sort of inferred from legends or documentary sources like inscriptions, but now we have firm ancient DNA evidence from the Wat Khom No cemetery in Cambodia, where this ancient individual shows about 40 to 50% of his genome deriving from South India. And in places like Sumatra and Cambodia, of course, you have this long-standing local stories about an Indian male ancestor marrying a local princess or a Naga princess in many cases. A lot of those tend to be recycled across time and space. But the bigger point I really want to drive in here is that Southeast Asians had a lot of agency in the way they interpreted Indic models of polity and religion and so on. There are features in Southeast Asian Hinduism and Buddhism that are quite exclusive to Southeast Asia, whether it's the kind of mudras that the Buddha is displaying, right? He's often seen in double Abhaya Mudra or double Vitarka Mudra, which you don't really see in India, or the octagonal temples of Sambor Praikuk, which is a city that William and I have both visited. Amazing cities, filled with 7th and 8th century temples, and most of these temples are octagonal, Ashtastra temples, But you don't really find a lot of octagonal temples in early India. They are there in the architectural treatises. The Matsya Purana, for example, refers to these octagonal temples, but you don't really find them on the ground. But the Cambodians, latch into this idea and they decide, let's build, most of our temples as octagonal structures, at least in Sambur Prai Cook. So there have been lots of different models that scholars have evolved to talk about these processes. They see it as localization, cosmopolitanism. I tend to favor the convergence model because of the fact that Southeast Asia and South Asia share a lot of things in common to begin with. Okay, let's just have a look at some of the textual and archaeological sources for this interaction. One of the earliest references, this is definitely interpolated, it's from the Sundara Kandam, but it has a lovely reference to Java, which you can reach by ship, right? It's described as Yavadvipa, rich in jewels, splendid with its 7 kingdoms, and to Swarna Rupyaka, ornamented with gold mines. And of course, this label of Southeast Asia as the land of gold has kind of stuck on. If you go to Bangkok, you're going to land at Suvarna Bhumi Airport. But it might be more connected with the idea of gaining fortunes from trading in the region rather than actually sort of engaging with gold mines, which are actually few and far between in Southeast Asia. As I said, we have lots of archaeological evidence for Indian activity in Southeast Asia, lots of pottery, lots of semi-precious stones, and of course these Mauryan ring stones are interesting because they were found in Thailand in conjunction with gold foils which bore the same designs. So it gave us a sense that they were using these, at least in Thailand, as jewelry molds. And even the kinds of semi-precious objects that we find, they are being fashioned into shapes and motifs very peculiar to Southeast Asia, like the carnelian tigers, for example. Those are really popular in Southeast Asia. And even though the carnelian might be coming from India, and they may have been worked by Indian smiths in Southeast Asia, the shape is something that we only find in Southeast Asia, and to some extent in southern China as well. Early pottery is found as far afield as Bali in the east. And what were the Indians coming to Southeast Asia for? What were they interested in trading? Now, there's a whole bunch of forest products, camphor, benzoin, stick-like, civet musk, rattan, gold, of course, that's something that's referred to in textual sources, cloves and nutmeg. There's actually an early find of a nutmeg from Sangul from the Kushana period site. Okay, just a few glimpses of the early epigraphic and sculptural record. Don't have a lot of time for this, so I'm going to zoom through it quite quickly. Some of the earliest inscriptions that we have in an Indic script and an Indic language are interestingly from Borneo, right? You wouldn't expect it. You'd think, it'd be somewhere on the coast of like Myanmar or Malaya, but these 4th or 5th century inscriptions are found in Kutai, which is of course now famous because it's going to be the new capital of Indonesia, and I think, that was quite deliberate, right? Going back to the origins, as it were, of Indonesian history. And these inscriptions tell us about the King Mulavarman's performance of very lavish Vedic sacrifices, including one called Bahu Suvarnaka, literally, meaning lots of gold. And scholars have been divided as to how to interpret them. I mean, there are records of gifts of hundreds of cows to Brahmins, but it doesn't seem to tally with the kind of environment that we have in Borneo. Remember, it's heavily forested. It's not a good place for breeding lots of cows. So is a lot of this just exaggeration? Quite possibly. I mean, you see poetic exaggeration of this sort in Sanskrit inscriptions in South Asia as well. But the broader point is that they were very consciously adopting these Indic modes of kingship, and that comes through really quite well in Purnavarman's inscription from West Java, dating to almost around the same period. And in one of these inscriptions, he compares his feet to those of Vishnu, Riva Patadvayam. And in another inscription, he does the same to his elephant, where he compares its footprints to those of Airavata, right, Indra's elephants. And moving on to slightly later periods, 7th, 8th century inscriptions get even more interesting. There's one from central Vietnam, which talks about temple to Valmiki, right? So they're very conscious in these 7th, 8th century inscriptions of the Sanskrit epic tradition. There's another one from the 6th century in northern Cambodia that talks about a grant for the recitation of the Ramayana in a temple context, and also the Purana and the Mahabharata, which are referred to in the same inscription. But it's not just Sanskrit, right? This story can only be told with the inclusion of other Indic languages. In the Mon-speaking areas of Myanmar and Thailand, Pali is a very important epigraphic language, and we also have Tamil, right? Tamils still remain the most significant demographic group in Southeast Asia, concentrated today mostly in Myanmar, Malaysia, Singapore, and Sumatra. But the Tamil footprint has been around in Southeast Asia for almost 2,000 years. The earliest inscriptions going back to the 2nd and 3rd century. The most interesting one on the screen is that belonging to a goldsmith, right? The inscription literally reads, Perum Pattan Kal, the stone of the great goldsmith. And we know that there have lots of documentary sources have been lost to us because Chinese records do make mention of them. The Sui Shu, the history of the Sui dynasty, for example, talks about a Chinese general plundering the capital of Champa, that's in central Vietnam, and carrying away 1,350 volumes of Buddhist scripture in the local language. But a lot of this is lost to us because people in Southeast Asia, like in many parts of India, were writing on palm leaves. And when you stop copying text on palm leaves, they cease to exist. And we know that they're writing on palm leaves because we've got imitations of these leaves that were buried, for example, in stupas, as you see on the screen of this 4th or 5th century golden manuscript that imitates the shape of the palm leaves. Just turning briefly to iconography, I mean, obviously, again, the inspiration is Indian. They're drawing from Gupta or Andhran models, and you see variations, right? There's a strong pick and choose kind of thing going on. You see Vishnus with the conch on the hip style, but you also see Vishnus holding this globular object, which you find in some Gupta period Vishnus as well. And the Buddhists, of course, were very active in Southeast Asia as well, and they were quite conscious of their Hindu competitors. There's this lovely relief from Thamprap Potisat in central Thailand. It's a cave site that shows the Buddha being venerated by Vishnu and Shiva. Now, in Indian context, Vishnu and Shiva are mostly the absent reference. You find Brahma and Indra worshipping the Buddha, but here, it's Vishnu and Shiva who are venerating the Buddha. And the Gupta models of the Buddha, they continue to be quite pervasive in Southeast Asian sculpture long after the Gupta fashion sort of falls, out of fashion in India. So these are 8th century images from the middle Mekong Valley in Laos and southern Cambodia, but long after the Gupta style, ceased to be current in India itself. Okay, just finally, turning to a case of localization, how the texts are being reinterpreted in local contexts. I'd like to start with the Javanese Ramayana. It's the earliest Southeast Asian Ramayana that we have, dates to the 9th century. And interestingly, it's not inspired directly from the Valmiki Ramayana, but the Bhatti Kavya, or Bhatti's Ravanavada. So they were really up to date with more recent versions of the Ramayana as well. And it's almost contemporary with the Ramayanic reliefs that we find on the Prambanan temple in central Java. Now, if you read the Javanese Ramayana, you would think that the action is taking place on the island of Java and not in northern India. The landscape is entirely localized. You have the mountain Menakagiri, for example, calling out to Hanuman, telling him, you can take shelter, take rest on me. I will treat you to rose apple and durian, mango, mangosteen, kachapi, lime, limus, kapundung, langsep, and sweet duhet, and a variety of Southeast Asian fruits. Again, same thing with the seascapes. They are populated by fish that a Southeast Asian audience would have been familiar with. So these are the famous Shaivite temples in Prambanan, central Java. They have the finest series of Ramayanic reliefs anywhere in the world, really, in my opinion. And finally, let me turn briefly to the Ramayana in Myanmar. Now, unlike Java, we don't have an old Ramayana that survives in Myanmar. There are textual references to the Ramayanic story in earlier Mon, Pew, and Burmese sources, but the Ramayanas that are popular in Myanmar today mostly date to the late 18th century, especially the Yama Pyasa Toji by Nemyo Nataka Kokang. And I'm just going to read a short passage from this to end it off, to give you a sense of how the Ramayana has been localized in Myanmar. So the context of this is Sita's second fire ordeal. When she comes back from the forest, this is after she has Lava and Kusha, and she's asked to go through another fire ordeal. So the people of Ayodhya are curious about Tida, that's how the Burmese called Sita's fire ordeal. They have never seen one before, and they will go to see it when she returns. Women folk, however, show special interest in the ordeal, and many of them discuss it. One group, though, the consorts of Rama's three brothers, expresses discontent. Urmila is the first to express her opinion. After such a long-term banishment that Sita suffered when she was away from her home, Rama is being unfair. She takes off the earplug and throws it away as a sign of discontent. Hemila, another discontented person, says, after Sita proved her innocence with the fire ordeal, she was banished to a distant forest. She suffered a long time in the forest, and now she is requested to undergo another fire ordeal. It is unfair that she has such bad luck. We are unhappy to live in such an unfair world. Now, true to form, the women of this Burmese Ramayana are feisty, as you would expect of the Burmese woman, and it's also being used as a vehicle for transmitting contemporary discontent with the status of women in 18th century Myanmar. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, two spectacular presentations, incredibly wide-ranging, incredibly fascinating, and based on such depth of knowledge and research. Both of you, amazing. Just a couple of questions before I throw it open to the audience. Naman, first of all, what happened to Southern Buddhism? It's much more invisible than Northern Buddhism. You can go around the north, you can still see the great stupas at Sarnath, Sanchi. There are a lot of Buddhist stuff lying around. Why, when you go to Kanchipuram, is there nothing visible of the Buddhist world that once existed?
There are statues in the Chennai Museum that were found in the Kanchipuram area. There are still statues lying forgotten under wayside shrines in the Kanchipuram area of Buddha. The temples seem to have fallen out of use at some point. And the questions that need to be asked are, what made those temples fall out of use? Was it a conscious effort to make them fall out of use, or did public opinion change? What led to a shift in public patronage in Tamil Nadu? What were the forces that we know aided that shift in public patronage? So I think these are tough questions to ask. I mean, they're not quite tough questions to ask, but I think they're tough questions to answer definitively. Because there are statues that are lying around. Now, one port remained, Nagapattinam. And indeed, in the Chola period, Nagapattinam continued to make sculpture and trade with Sri Lanka, Jaffna, and further down.
You can see very nice Nagapattinam statues of all places in the Chandigarh Museum. There's some nice little bronzes there. There's also currently in the National Museum about contemporary modern art in Jaipur House.
Yeah, it's
in the Roots and Roots
that's
exhibition.
closed a few days ago. Yeah, but spectacular. Those were from the Chennai Museum. So yes, there were shrines, Buddhist shrines, which fell out of use in southern India. Andhra, Telangana, Karnataka, Kerala and Tamil Nadu had a number of Buddhist shrines that did fall out of use. And one has to ask how those sculptures and those shrines were commandeered, how their materials were reused and turned into Brahmanical shrines. When did that happen? Where can we find...
A related question. How much of that whole Buddhist world in South India iconographically and otherwise migrates into the Hindu temples? Is there much influence, or is there a break?
Yes, I think there is. I think we need to not look at the cast of the main characters and iconography. There's no point, but it's important to look at the rest of the repertory, if you get my metaphor. I mean, it's the supporting cast. The main characters, whether it's a Vishnu or a Shiv or a Buddha, they change. But it's the Ganas, the Vidyadharas, the Gandharvas, the Kinnars, those characters that you see around them. That's where you see the paraphernalia that accompanies the main deity remains much the same linguistic visual lexicon that seems to carry on. And there we find very interesting continuities, especially from the Satvana Ikshvaku into the Chalukya material. So if you study Badami and look at all these little marginal figures in Badami and you try and compare them with the earlier lot of figures of the Ikshvakus in Nagarjunakonda, or when you look at it with Satvahana sites at Amaravati, there you will certainly see a lot of correspondences and continuities.
Suresh, looking to Southeast Asia, an earlier generation of Indian historians, the nationalist generation of the 1940s and 50s, were very keen on this idea of Hindu colonies, that you had, it was a sort of, the Raj, but of a Pallava variety, or a Chola variety, taking over chunks of Southeast Asia. Now, obviously, people go for more cultural transfusion or diffusion, and as the title of this lecture said, traders, teachers moving around, and your chaps leaving their DNA in the soil. But is there other than the Chola attack in 1025, which has that one big inscription in the Tanjore temple, what's the evidence for political or military action by India in Southeast Asia?
To be honest, there isn't much evidence to suggest that there was any kind of political imperialist enterprise. Even the success of the Chora campaign has been doubted. It's not quite clear whether there was any political control exercised after Rajendra's invasion of
What would you think? We've had Anirudh Kanisetti here 2 days ago, very much casting doubt on it. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, from an archaeological perspective, there certainly is a proliferation of Chora-style temples and granite images in a Chora idiom in Southeast Asia, coming from sites in southern Thailand and Sumatra, which is precisely the same port where the same port sites are where Tamil traders have been visiting for centuries. So I think there might have been some sort of, quasi-political presence in those port cities, particularly in the Straits of Malacca. Because
that's quite a big deal. Yeah. Controlling the Straits of Malacca gives you access to China. And so if you do have actual political control of the Straits, that implies genuine Indian sea power in Southeast Asia.
And one can make that inference on the basis of the 12th and 13th century Hindu Chora-style temples that we find in Qianzhou in southern China, right? That might have been the end game for some of the Tamil traders involved in this region. So going back earlier, there's also a 7th century inscription in southern Thailand at a site called Takwapa, where the Tamil traders who set up this temple to Vishnu, the image still survives. It's very much in the Pallava idiom. And they name the temple's tank after the ruling Pallava king, Nandivarman III, right? It's a bit like, naming sites in North America after like Elizabeth or Charles II and so on.
Or James, Duke of York.
It's really not paying any kind of lip service to local authorities when you name a structure after the king who lives, far away. So you're kind of claiming some kind of political space, even though, and there have also been Pallava royal seals that have turned up in Thailand and Sumatra as well. So it's possible that there might have been a political representative, but by and large, I would say the presence is more mercantile than political.
To both of you, just a final question before we open up. The idea that's sometimes floated, first I think by Dennis Hudson, and more recently in The Ocean of Churn by Sanjeev Sanyal, that Pallava kings came back from Southeast Asia and ruled in Kanchipuram. Do either of you buy that story?
I mean, that's really made on the basis of this one inscription that we find in the Vaikunta Perumal temple in Kanchipuram. And even then, like the word that he uses is gaganam, right? A deep abyss. That's what he says he crosses. So it's not even clear if it's supposed to be an ocean or some other kind of, topographical structure. Yeah,
it's a distant.
I would say a lot of speculation is involved there. But the Pallava and Khmer families do share some legends in common, in particular the one that I alluded alluded to earlier about, marrying this Naga princess and tracing descent from them. So, but those are literary motifs that are recycled throughout India and Southeast Asia.
Thanks. Yes, I mean, I think that's exactly the point where I can lift off. I can't really comment on the nature of the sources of the 7th to 10th century period Sanskrit and Tamil that is being used in South India at that time. I don't specialize in that. But one does need to ask the larger historical question about what's the nature of the intentions behind the nomenclature and the kind of cultural references that they are making at this time, and what does that signify? Who is being placated, or what does that kind of imperial authority mean to people in Southeast Asia? One needs to ask whether, to what extent does propaganda help in the maintenance of a balance of trade? Why do Southeast Asian merchants and governors and kings need to maintain a certain balance of trade in favor of India rather than balance of trade or be autonomous in that trade or trade with China? What are the forces that lead them to favor India as their trading partner? And I think let's ask those tough questions, because I think the answers will come out to be quite interesting, that there is a profitable and beneficial trading arrangement in all likelihood. Otherwise, the local population and governors would have sought to trade with somebody else.
We're out of time, but I'm still going to defy Paul and ask for one question from the audience. First, their hand up, this gentleman here.
So, as these presentations were very insightful, so I'm curious to know the research methodology which you adopted while making these, because all the bits of these historical documentation are scattered all over the South Asian region. So, it's good if the people who are interested to do further studies or researches about it, if you can show some light towards the research methodology of yours.
Your research methodology, meaning how did we find these sculptures and how did I find all this material, or what is my way of studying this material?
So how you put all these scattered pieces into an insightful presentation like this?
That's the geniuses these men are.
I don't know what to say. Yeah. I mean, we read different kinds of histories and different kinds of sources. You pull out, you are tasked with that. You work in a museum basement for many years, and you have to think creatively about what each little object and terracotta shard in that museum means. And you have to try and use all the possible resources available to you to read the histories of that time, to be able to fit it into some kind of a narrative, to imagine how it could have been used, and there has to be a very plausible set of reasons as to why. So, for instance, when I did more scientific and rigorous and more sedate scholarly work, when I was given the opportunity and time to do that, one could sit down and actually do that kind of research per object.
I highly recommend both these gentlemen's books. Naman's incredible Gandharan volume of Marg is widely available. Suresh's Tropical Turn is one of my books of the year from last year. Absolutely fantastic. I think Tropical Turn is on sale now. It's sold out. You've missed it, I'm afraid, but it is available on Amazon and in all good bookshops. And I'll be producing a book on this subject next September called The Golden Road. So you can go through all my footnotes minutely.
Thank you all very much, and I am sure that our speakers will be ready.
कर देना आसान है, पर डेटॉल है तो आसान मत चुनो। बढ़ते रहो। इतनी धूल मिट्टी, ये सोचकर कोशिश छोड़ देना आसान है, पर डेटॉल है तो आसान मत चुनो। बढ़ते रहो। आगे बढ़ने की राह में धूल, मिट्टी, जर्म्स, बीमारी तो आएंगे, इसलिए मेरा भरोसा सिर्फ डेटॉल, जो दे जर्म से सुरक्षा और आगे बढ़ने का विश्वास। डेटॉल, क्योंकि बढ़ते रहना है जरूरी।
नानी को लेके बैंक जाना है एड्रेस चेंज के लिए, संभाल लेना प्लीज। ब्रांच आओगी? ऐसा क्यों? चल वीडियो कॉल करते हैं ना। प्लीज, ब्रांच बंद हो जाएगी। गुड आफ्टरनून मैम, वेलकम टू AU 0101 डिजिटल बैंक। क्या कर रही हो? AU वीडियो बैंकिंग। यहाँ बैंक के सारे काम हो सकते हैं, तो ब्रांच क्यों जाना? सोच बदलो और बैंक भी। AU स्मॉल फाइनेंस बैंक, बदलाव हमसे है।
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the Samsung Galaxy Tab S9 series Jaipur Literature Festival at the Darbar Hall.